etc. Now, what's the strategy? How do we actually buy an asset and never sell the asset? That's what we're going to talk about here. So I was just going to show you here. So this is the real stuff. So you can see here, my friend Wendy on Twitter said, my friend Mark convinced me not to sell some Bitcoin to buy my dream house. Don't sell your Bitcoin to buy your dream house. I convinced her, and I'm going to break down the math for you the same way. So of course, never sell scarce assets. So those trophy assets, they only go up in value because they're so limited. There's more people chasing them and they're very hard to get back. The value keeps going up on those types of assets. So what we want to do is as the value goes up, instead of cashing in to get that value out, instead, we can use debt against the asset. I'm going to break that down. Now, when we do that, when we leverage debt, debt is not taxable. All right, so let me give you a house example. So in Wendy's case, for example, let's say that you had $200,000 of Bitcoin. And what you could do is you want $100,000 for a down payment on a house, for example. Now, this could be $20,000 of Bitcoin and you want a $10,000 down payment. It could be $2 million of Bitcoin and you want $1 million. You figure out the math for yourself. But let's say that you have $200,000 of Bitcoin and you want $100,000 for a down payment. Now, you have an option. The most option, what she wanted to do, was to sell $200,000 worth of Bitcoin. Now, the problem is when you sell that Bitcoin to realize that gain, you have to pay tax. Now, depending on how long you've held it and what your tax bracket is, you could pay as much as 50% tax on that, which means at the end of the day, you end up with $100K to put down. So you had 200, but you owe 50%. Now, it could be 35%. Like I said, depending on your tax bracket, how long you've held it. But let's say that you owned it for less than a year, your tax bracket's high, you're gonna pay 50% and you're gonna end up with $100K. So you lost $200,000 of Bitcoin to end up with $100,000 to put down on a piece of property. Another option would be to take the $200K and then you borrow 50% against it, right? And then you get the $100,000, but you have $100,000 to put down on the house and you still have the $200,000 in Bitcoin. Let me break this math down for you so you can see exactly how this works, all right? So, like I said, if we start with $100,000 in Bitcoin, I have all the math here for you. So let's break this down. So let's say, for example, that you have $100,000 worth of Bitcoin in the bank. Now, again, this could be $1,000, it could be $1 million or $10 million. You do the math in your own head. Let's say that it gains at 200%, like Michael Saylor said. Now, he says that well, obviously, we already know that it has gained 200% a year compounded annual for the last decade. He says it can continue to do that for the next decade, but let's not be anywhere near that aggressive. So let's say that it continues to do that this year. It's already done way more than that this year. I think it's at 300-400%. So it's already done more than that this year, but let's say that next year it slows down to 150, then it slows down to 100 for a couple years, then it goes to 50, 30, 20, 15, 15. Now remember, he said 200 all the way down, but let's not be that aggressive. So we start with $100,000 and we don't touch that, right? So let's say that you're working, you don't really need the money, and you give it 5 years. So we get to here year 5. Now, year 5, what you can do, you're sitting on about $3 million worth of Bitcoin. You could take a 5% loan to value, right? So you're borrowing $150,000 from your $3 million worth of Bitcoin. That $150,000 is tax-free. You don't pay tax on that. You didn't even sell your Bitcoin. All you did is you borrowed against it. So because it's debt, it's tax-free, and you can spend that money. You can go live on that. That can be your living expenses. So now you're living on $150,000 a year, tax-free. That's like making $300,000 a year before taxes, right? And you could use that money however you want. Now, the next year, it goes up again, it goes up 50%, and now you have $6 million, and the next year you borrow 5.5%, which is $330,000. The $330,000 is used to pay back the $150,000. You paid back the previous loan and you kept $180,000. So now you have more because your cost of living is going up, your money is going up. So you had $150,000 to live off the first year. The next year you have $180,000 tax-free to live on. It goes up, it goes by less this year. Now it goes up to $9 million. You borrow 5.8%, which is $500,000. You pay back the $330,000 and you keep $192,000 to live on and on and on and on. I'm not going to break down every single year, but here's the thing. At the end of year 10, hypothetically, if this worked out, you could end up sitting on well, you could end up sitting on $16 million of Bitcoin. That's how much you would own and control. $16 million in Bitcoin, or US dollar value of Bitcoin, I should say. Purchasing power. That's a key piece. So the number of Bitcoins you own won't go up. It's just the purchasing power. So for example, if you had $100,000 in your bank account, in 10 years, you still have $100,000 in your bank account. The difference is that $100,000 buys only about $80,000 worth of goods versus, let's say you had 10 Bitcoin in your bank account. In 10 years, you still have 10 Bitcoin in your bank account. But the difference is it buys more instead of less, like the dollars. So in this hypothetical example, you'd have $16 million of US dollar valuation of Bitcoin, and you would owe about $3.8 million of debt. So you owe debt. You're $3.8 million in debt against that, which means you have a net of about $12 million, but you've been able to pull all this money out completely tax-free and live year after year. Your cost of living is going up 180, 192, 203, 221,000 per year, all tax-free, all off of your starting value of $100,000 in Bitcoin. So that's the strategy.